Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're kind of putting on our detective hats to unravel a historical, true crime mystery. But instead of a whodunit, it's more of a what happened to it. We are looking at the spectacular life cycle of alternative rock. We're going to track how a musical movement that was born out of pure rebellion, anger, and anti-commercialism skyrocketed to global dominance, only to be systematically dismantled and repackaged by the exact same machine it was trying to destroy. It's an absolutely fascinating story about art, commerce, and the battle for the radio dial.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is the central paradox we really have to solve today. How on earth did a genre that prided itself on being the ultimate misfit, the ultimate anti-establishment voice, end up becoming corporate radio's biggest victim? Well, to understand that tragic end, we have to go all the way back to its incredibly humble, fiercely independent beginnings.
Section 1. College Radio Roots. If we rewind back to the 1970s and 80s, long before alternative music was selling out arenas, it lived way over on the far left of the FM dial. While commercial Top 40 was pumping out these highly polished, repetitive hits, college stations were basically the Wild West. As this quote brilliantly illustrates, these format-free stations were literally rock's minor leagues. This was the undiscovered launching pad where bands like REM and Talking Heads established themselves. They were championed by passionate DJs who valued pure expression over commercial formulas. But, as we all know, you can only keep a secret that good for so long.
Section 2, the 1991 alternative explosion. And that brings us to a massive seismic shift in the cultural landscape. The dam completely broke. The underground suddenly and violently smashed through, and the music industry was caught totally off guard. Just look at this timeline. In 1990, there were roughly a dozen modern rock stations in the entire United States. Then boom, 1991, Nirvana releases Smells Like Teen Spirit. And it wasn't even meant to be a breakthrough hit, but the demand was completely unprecedented. Record labels literally had to halt production on other artists just to press enough copies of Nirvana's Nevermind album. The industry just scrambled to accommodate this explosion, and by 1992, over 100 modern rock stations had popped up almost overnight just to play this new sound.
The culture clash was immediate and honestly hilariously jarring. The traditional rock audience at the time was heavily into hair metal, right? So when alternative rock started taking over, you had these incredibly surreal moments. Take late 1991, for example, when Nirvana guest starred on MTV's heavy metal show Headbangers Ball. You had Kurt Cobain appearing on national television, decked out in full drag, sitting opposite these very confused, leather-clad traditional metal fans, all while a host desperately tried to get everyone to play along. I mean, it was just the perfect visual representation of the old guard clashing with the new misfits.
Section 3. Welcome to Alternative Nation. So, television didn't just document this clash, it actively cemented alternative music's new cultural dominance. MTV realized they needed dedicated programming just to capture this massive, hungry audience. So, in 1992, they launched Alternative Nation. Hosted by the iconic VJ Kennedy, this show is absolutely pivotal. We really can't overstate Kennedy's impact on MTV culture here. She provided a quirky, accessible, and highly visible face to a movement that used to be strictly underground. While MTV's late-night show, 12 Minutes, played the indie darlings, Kennedy's Alternative Nation was blasting heavy hitters like Smashing Pumpkins, Pearl Jam, and Oasis directly into millions of living rooms right in prime time. The underground wasn't just mainstream anymore, it was the dominant youth culture. Section 4. Corporatization and Classic Alternative.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is that this is where our true crime mystery takes a darker turn. By the early 2000s, corporate radio realized they needed to package and control this aging genre through a classic alternative format. Looking at this forensic data from Coleman Insights in 2004, we can see exactly how the industry manipulated the format. Notice the green bars representing the old average music era for two heritage stations, KNDD in Seattle and WNNX in Atlanta, versus the red bars for their new format. Now, KND actually shifted their average era backward by more than 4 years. That's a real noticeable change in what you'd hear on the radio. But WNNX, their average era barely shifted by a single year. It was a complete marketing gimmick.
And this brilliantly illustrates the deception even further. When you look at how much contemporary brand new music they were playing while claiming to be classic alternative, well, the contrast is stark. KNDD genuinely adjusted, cutting their recent music in half, from 59% down to 26%. WNNX, on the other hand, they kept their contemporary playlist at a massive 50%. It was total smoke and mirrors.
To summarize this data, corporate radio was learning to game the system. They were running stations like WNNX in Atlanta, branding them as nostalgic or alternative, while actually playing it incredibly safe, barely changing the playlist and serving up the exact same repetitive tracks. The adventurous spirit of college radio was being fully replaced by calculated, risk-averse corporate spreadsheets. But how did these corporations get so much power over the dial in the first place?
Section 5. The 1996 Telecom Act.
Well, this brings us to the fatal blow. The real killer of independent radio wasn't a change in musical taste. It was government deregulation. In 1996, the United States passed the Telecommunications Act. This was actually the first major rewrite of broadcast law in 62 years. Before this, there were strict limits to prevent monopolies. No company could own more than 40 stations nationally or more than 4 in a single market. The 1996 Act completely lifted that national limit and doubled the local limit to 8 stations. The explicitly stated goal was promoting competition, but as we'll see, the reality was the exact opposite.
Let's just walk through exactly how this domino effect worked. Step 1, the ownership limits are deregulated. Step 2, this triggers a frenzy of mega mergers, forming massive media conglomerates that just gobble up independent stations all across the country. Step 3, to maximize profit across hundreds of stations, these conglomerates eliminate local programming and those quirky DJs we talked about. They replace them with tightly formatted, repetitive playlists featuring broad appeal artists. It also fueled the rise of payola, where big labels could afford to push their safe, established talent onto the airwaves, completely shutting out independent and small label artists. Niche music was effectively dead on commercial radio. It was a homogenization that basically paved the way for the safe, algorithmic playlists we're always complaining about today.
Section 6. Who killed rock radio?
We can see exactly who killed rock radio by looking at what happened on the ground in local markets. Let's look at a prime example, Minneapolis. They had a beloved, deeply adventurous station called Rev 105. It was programmed by a veteran rock club DJ, playing this dizzying, risk-taking mix from Beck to James Brown, and it had great ratings. But in 1997, thanks to those new Telecom Act rules, Disney and ABC were able to swoop in and purchase Rev 105 for $17.8 million. Literally overnight, the idiosyncratic hybrid station vanished. It was immediately replaced with tightly formatted, safe corporate rock. As the former music director of Rev 105 put it at the time, when you report to Mickey Mouse, the bottom line always supersedes musical risk-taking.
So the crucial point is summarized perfectly by this 1998 quote from Spin magazine. Alternative music had finally morphed into the exact repetitive, pop-driven monster it originally sought to destroy. By focusing purely on ratings, heavy rotation of a few catchy singles, and appealing to the broadest possible advertiser base, modern rock radio really just became top 40 with louder guitars.
We've seen how the passionate, format-free days of college radio gave birth to a revolution, only for that revolution to be packaged, homogenized, and swallowed whole by media conglomerates, which leaves us with a pretty provocative question to consider today. In an era where massive corporations still dominate our airwaves and streaming platforms, is there still room on the dial for genuine musical risk-taking? Or is the next Nirvana destined to stay underground forever? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning what you hear, and I'll see you next time.